It's very rare in the gaming industry that we ever get genre-defining titles. Games that are at the forefront of their own respective genres and set the industry standard for future similar games. We were lucky and somehow got 2 last year, but these kinds of games are very seldomly released. Games that shake the whole world and leave its mark in gaming history. Elden Ring for the Souls-like, Fortnite for the Battle Royales, God of War Ragnarok for the story-based action adventures. These games are all massively difficult to produce and required an extensive team of passionate developers who poured their blood, sweat, and tears into creating these masterpieces. New titles that set the status quo for their respective genres and are incredibly rare and only come out once in a blue moon. But what about JRPGs? What genre-defining games do they have? And to that, you would probably say, well, that's easy, the Final Fantasy series. They've been a household name for a long time now. And you would be correct, they have been. Now let's add another layer to this question. What are the genre-defining turn-based JRPGs? For some of you, this is still an easy question. You would probably answer the Persona series, and you would be right again. So now let's make this question actually difficult. What genre-defining 2D turn-based RPGs were released recently? This is a question that would stump most casual gamers, and even hardcore gamers as well. So let me answer that question for you. Octopath Traveler 2. To say that it's just genre defining wouldn't do it nearly enough justice to describe the masterpiece that Octopath Traveler 2 is. And the worst part is, you probably will never play it. You see, Octopath Traveler is catered to such a small and specific niche of gamers in an already niche genre that I would wager 90% of gamers have never played it, let alone heard about it. But if you're in that minute 10% of people who has even a passing interest in this genre of video games, then Octopath Traveler 2 is a must play if you appreciate beautiful art styles, amazing original soundtracks, and compelling stories. And despite this being the sequel, you don't have to play the first one to know what's going on here, because Octopath Traveler 2 is its own standalone game with a whole new cast of characters and entirely new setting. I know, I might be some random internet guy with zero credibility to his name, so all I really have is my word. But if you decide to stick around for what this small-time internet stranger has to say, then it would be my honor to show you why Octopath Traveler 2 is a masterpiece. In order for me to explain why Octopath Traveler 2 is so good, we're first gonna need to rewind back to the 90s. This is the era where most people would argue was the golden age of JRPGs. Before the time of live services and battle passes, where developers were allowed to create passion projects without having to appease apathetic shareholders and greedy publishers. We had games like Final Fantasy VI, Secret of Mana, Xenogears, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VII, and so much more. Since technology was limited back then, developers had to find workarounds to fit their wildly ambitious ideas into just a few megabytes that the game cartridges they came in could store. So that's why they had to use less detailed graphics by today's standards. And it might not seem like much now, but back then these games were groundbreaking when they came out. You see, the standards for games back then were so low, they were pretty much non-existent. So when games like Chrono Trigger featured a massive open world to explore, engaging combat, and beautiful 2D artwork, It was pretty mind-blowing for a 10-year-old kid to experience this for the first time. And despite the limitations, these games are all fondly remembered by the gaming community because they were responsible for shaping many of our childhoods. And after almost 3 decades, they're still considered masterpieces by today's standards. But the thing is, after 3 decades, things change. Technology got better and so did video games. 3D real-time action games became more and more popular and 2D games fell to the wayside, making way for the new generation of games like Fortnite and Warzone, leaving our childhood memories to collect dust, never to be touched again. Everyone believed that 2D turn-based RPGs were a relic of the past and that it could never make it back into mainstream gaming ever again. And they're kinda right. Why would anyone want a less detailed looking 2D game when we have amazing 3D graphical fidelity now? And so developers decide to let sleeping dogs lie and slowly let this genre fade into obscurity. That is, until 2018 when Square Enix released the first Octopath Traveler. This game blew away the RPG world with its beautifully unique HD 2D graphics, engaging turn-based combat, and multiple unique storylines. Octopath Traveler brought the nostalgia of the past and updated it with the production quality of the present. The game was extremely popular despite being in a really unpopular niche and sold over 3 million copies worldwide, bringing back hope to fans of the genre. But despite the high praise and popularity, it had some major flaws, like the combat getting tedious at times and the character stories never really involving each other. Even though the first Octopath Traveler had some issues, it undeniably brought life back into the genre, allowing games like Triangle Strategy, Chained Echoes, and Bravely Default to release with relative success. All great games within their own rights, but could never really command the same mass appeal, whether it was because the games didn't have enough marketing or they didn't have enough production quality. Either way, these games were criminally unknown by the larger gaming community and were still left behind to collect dust. That is, until the 24th of February, 5 years after the first Octopath Traveler released, Octopath Traveler 2 made its debut to the world stage with an unquenchable fire in its heart and unwavering determination in its eyes. This game set out to improve on the flaws of the first game and add even more gameplay features that beautifully coalesce together to make Octopath Traveler 2 the most polished, defining game for the 2D turn-based JRPG genre. And I truly think that this is the best game to fully represent to the world the highest potential a game like this can be with a AAA budget and passionate developers. Octopath Traveler 2 is the culmination of almost 3 decades worth of improvements to the turn-based formula, and here's why. I'm gonna be honest here. I know this game is not going to be for everyone, which is why I titled the video the way I did. If I name some features that Octopath Traveler has, most people would get immediately disinterested. Things like turn-based combat, random encounters, and 2D pixel graphics. Gameplay characteristics that old school JRPGs were known for would now drive away the modern gaming audience. But for the very few people who still have the patience for these kind of games, will find that Octopath Traveler 2 is a masterful recreation of the golden era of JRPGs. It's pretty clear that Octopath Traveler is massively inspired by older JRPG titles, but more specifically, it takes more inspiration from what is considered the best Final Fantasies of all time, Final Fantasy VI. Putting these two games side by side, it's almost a one-on-one comparison of gameplay structure. But instead of trying to be a straight derivative of Final Fantasy VI, the first Octopath Traveler improved and updated every aspect of it to fit a modern audience, while the second fixed the shortcomings of the first and refined the core elements to make it the masterclass level game that it is. Firstly, Octopath Traveler 2 noticeably looks visually better than the first did. You see, although the first game had really detailed sprites and backgrounds, the graphics always had this weird filter that made the game always have this kind of washed out look to it. And since this was the only Octopath Traveler at the time, it wasn't really noticeable, but when the second game released, it was almost a night and day difference of visual direction. Instead of keeping the same looks, Octopath Traveler 2 added a dynamic lighting system with an actual day and night cycle that makes the environments look much more saturated. It's most noticeable during the nighttime when you're in a town and the lighting of the lanterns and houses illuminate the dark streets to create an almost picturesque sea of glimmering lights that brilliantly shine like stars do in the night sky. But the day and night cycle doesn't just make the game look better, it also has an impact on the gameplay as well. Each character in Octopath Traveler has a unique action that they can do to interact with NPCs in the world. For example, in the first game, the merchant Tressa can purchase items from NPCs, while the thief Therian can steal from them, both being ways to acquire items from NPCs, only being differentiated by their noble or rogue classifications. The problem with this system is that it massively limits team building. I have to bring either one of these two characters out of the 8 in the roster if I want to be able to procure any items for NPCs. The sequel, however, alleviates this issue by giving characters two path actions, one for the daytime and one for the nighttime. For example, the warrior Hikari during the daytime can challenge NPCs to a duel, while during the nighttime he can bribe them for information. This addition is such a huge improvement because it frees up the restrictions of team building by having half of the characters in the roster being able to achieve the same goal. Although technically you could still lock yourself out of a mechanic if you specifically choose the characters that can't do that action, but it's very unlikely that an average player would run into this problem. This allows the freedom to build your team however you want without having to worry about missing out on certain gameplay elements, and just overall streamlines the game for a much smoother experience. A major complaint that many players had for the first Octopath Traveler was that the combat was too slow, and combined with the random encounters, made it oftentimes tedious to play through. And despite many people not liking random encounters, they were still kept in the game. But in order to remedy this issue, the developers added a speed up option in the sequel, which might seem like a small change, but made the world of a difference because fights no longer take what felt like ages to complete. And while I did enjoy the combat in the first game, it did eventually get monotonous after the millionth random encounter when I'm just trying to get to the next town. So a speed up option was a welcome addition to the sequel. Another welcome addition in Octopath 2's combat is the latent power system. This system adds a whole new layer to the turn-based combat and helps break up the monotony of it, and can even help turn the tides of a battle in a difficult boss fight. This system is basically the limit break of Octopath Traveler, but it's much more flexible and allows for more varied gameplay. For example, the dancer Agnia's latent power makes her single target spells an AoE to all allies or enemies, and I can combine her latent power with her lion dance skill, which normally applies an attack buff to one ally for 2 turns, but with the latent power and 3x boost, I can apply it to all allies for 9 turns. This is just one example of how flexible latent powers can be, and each character's latent power has their own unique effect. And I'm glad that they're more creative than just do more damage. Although there are some characters like that, even then they have options that make you think about how to best apply them for the situation you're in. And the best part of it is that latent power gain is liberally given out to you, and you retain your meter outside of combat, meaning that you don't have to save it for the next boss fight. So many games that include some sort of limit break-esque system have a problem where you get these powerful ultimate abilities, but you can only use them on enemies you're currently fighting, and the meter will be reset after the battle is over. Octopath allowing you to carry over your latent power between fights removes the stress of having to use them right then and there, streamlining the whole meter gain process and allowing you to prepare better before a big boss fight. These latent powers are overall a huge boon to the gameplay that helps break up the tedium of combat, and because it's so readily available, it rewards experimentation and liberal usage. I also love how much team customization this game has available to you. There are 12 classes, or jobs in total, and each character will have one primary job that can't be changed and an open secondary job that you can freely choose. And these jobs will determine the skills that your characters can use. They can also give you access to powerful passive abilities that aren't restricted by the jobs you're currently using. So I can use the merchant passives on my character who's a warrior thief hybrid, and this opens up a new layer of the game for so much experimentation and theory crafting. Octopath Traveler 2 also lets you finally equip multiple of the same jobs if you wanted to. In the first game, a secondary job can only be equipped by one character, so if I gave one of my characters the warrior's secondary job, I can't give it to another character, even if I'm not currently using them. And this severely limited team building and customization. Fortunately, Octopath 2 fixed this, and now you're able to build your characters in any way that you please without restriction, and it's a very well needed quality of life update. Now let's be honest here, there's a reason why most people today don't like turn-based combat. It's because turn-based combat is really boring to sit through. So in order to make it not boring, there needs to be some sort of X factor that's sort of unique to the game and somewhat keeps the players engaged. Persona has the all-out attack mechanic, Chained Echoes has an overdrive system, Pokemon has terrestrialization, but what X factor does Octopath Traveler have? The most notable and impactful mechanic this game has is the boost system. Although this was already a mechanic in the first game, I feel like it's worth mentioning because of just how impactful it is to the gameplay. In each battle, your characters generate one boost point each turn, which is represented by the red circles above the health bars. These boost points can be used to boost the strength of your skills and spells, whether it's by increasing its potency or the amount of time as it hits. And it might not seem like it, but this system adds a deceptive level of complexity to the game because you can boost almost all of your skills. For example, I could choose to use 3 boost points to add 3 extra attacks to my basic attack in order to break the boss's shield. But if I do that, then I won't have any more to use once I do break the boss, and I want to use the opportunity to do a massive burst on it. So I could also save my BP and take a little longer breaking the boss, but when I finally break it, I could use all of my BP to do massive damage during my burst phase. There are so many more uses for BP that I haven't mentioned, and the sheer amount of flexibility allows for endless amounts of variations on how you can use them. This system rewards smart usage of it and encourages you to experiment with different skills, and when you combine it with the latent powers, there's a near endless amount of different ways you can tackle a situation. So this makes each playthrough extremely varied, and I'm glad it made a return in Octopath Traveler 2. What I'm also glad made a return from the first game are the difficult boss encounters. There are a plethora of boss fights in Octopath 2, and each one of them is uniquely crafted with their own individual mechanics and attacks. And no two bosses are ever the same or reused as filler in order to meet some arbitrary playtime quota. Each boss was thoughtfully placed in a specific area in order to match the significance it has on the story or lore in the surrounding area. I also love how the boss battles styles have a clear inspiration from Final Fantasy VI's boss battles, where the bosses would have a fully detailed and beautiful sprites that are much larger than the normal enemies to give the sense that they're imposing and a looming threat over your party. Although some bosses did tend to lean more towards the easy side of the difficulty spectrum, there was no shortage of difficult fights that had me on the edge of my seat the whole way through. Especially near the end game, the boss fights felt like I was playing a chess match against a grandmaster player, and one wrong move could spell the end of my party. And many times, that's exactly what happened. I played through the whole game without really grinding or over leveling the bosses, and I was usually around 5 levels down in most boss fights. And I think this is right within the sweet spot of difficulty where they hit sufficiently hard enough, but never hard enough to one-shot you. Even if you're on level with the bosses, they still provide a challenging enough fight to make you strategically think about how you're going to approach. That's just a testament to how well the developers have balanced the game for the casual player. I think there was only one boss out of the dozens in this game where I felt was kinda cheap, and that was the boss that petrifies your party and you need a specific item to cure it, or else the character is out of the entire fight, not even allowed to be revived. But that was only a one-off instance, and thankfully they never used that mechanic again. And hopefully if there's ever a third installment, they can add more features to these boss fights to make them even more engaging. The biggest problem that the first Octopath Traveler had was that the 8 character stories weren't really compelling in any way. Sure, they had some good moments, but most of them never really felt deep enough to make a strong impression. And for some reason, the characters never really acknowledged each other even though they were traveling together in the same party. Octopath Traveler 2, however, made no small effort to fix these issues by having the individual character stories being leaps and bounds better than the previous ones. The first noticeable change is that Octopath 2 is fully voice acted. Previously, there was only voice acting for the major cutscenes, and the other 80% of dialogue were filled with grunts and generic voice quips. The sequel adding voice acting to all cutscenes made a massive difference in how I as a player immersed myself into the world and really connect with these characters. And Octopath Traveler 2 has no shortage of deep and thought-provoking moments. The stories here remind me of the impact the classic JRPG stories had on the world when we played them as kids. The look of horror on our faces as we watch Sephiroth descend from above to stab Aerith in Final Fantasy VII, the elation we had once we beat the final boss and saved the world in Chrono Trigger, or the bittersweet emptiness we felt in Persona 3 as our protagonist breathes his last dying breath, knowing that he can pass on without any regrets. Octopath 2's stories evoked a similar rollercoaster of emotions that these well-beloved games had, and as the name suggests, Octopath Traveler doesn't really have one singular plot, but 8 of them, each with their own pertinent individual themes and motifs. Many of these stories managed to captivate my full attention from beginning to end because of how expertly woven the plot points are into the writing. I will admit that these stories are still not expertly woven together, but it's reassuring to know that the developers did listen to the criticism and made an attempt to have the characters at least acknowledge each other's existence in a cohesive way with the cross-path story. And from a developer standpoint, having 8 individual characters with wildly different narratives in a game where you can customize your team to your heart's content and still somehow having them naturally involve each other in their stories is a logistical nightmare. The developers would need to account for every permutation and differentiation that a player can have on their team, create voice lines for each of the different scenarios they would be in, and somehow be written as an integral part of their stories for each of the 8 characters. I did the math on this, and there are 40,320 different team compositions possible in Octopath Traveler, so it's not physically possible for a human to account for all of these variations, let alone give them voice lines. And I commend the developers at Square for actually trying to achieve this monumental task. Side tangent aside, the narrative moments in Octopath Traveler 2 focuses on capturing the audience's attention by always leaving a little trail of narrative breadcrumbs for the players to feast on, but never quite enough to sate their hunger. always leaving enough little cliffhangers to keep it intriguing, but never so much that it becomes tiring or predictable. It consistently raises thought-provoking questions to the player and increasingly raises the stakes each cutscene until it comes to an almost masterful climax with the final boss fight of each character's path. And the best part is that when you finish all 8 character paths, that's where you would truly unlock the endgame, where all the character paths finally converge with each other in order to defeat the final boss of the game. It gives a sense of camaraderie and togetherness as we watch all of our characters that we've journeyed across the lands together for the last 50 or so hours assemble like the Avengers one last time to save the world from impending doom, and it's a perfect way to tie up every character's journey. I usually don't mention music in my game reviews because usually most people don't care, but I just have to gush about it because the soundtrack in Octopath Traveler 2 is sublime. Being composed by Yasunori Nishiki, who previously worked on titles like Final Fantasy VII Remake, Kingdom Hearts 3, and Octopath Traveler 1. Yasunori is an industry veteran, having a long resume that spans over 10 years in the gaming industry and the anime industry. So when he was selected once more to compose the soundtrack for Octopath 2, he absolutely surpassed all expectations with flying colors. There are 42 songs in Octopath Traveler 2's soundtrack, and not one song in it felt like a filler song. And each time a new track played during the gameplay, I'm completely astounded at how consistently the songs here manage to command a plethora of different emotions within me. The magnificence this soundtrack exudes transcends even the medium itself, joining the ranks of other games with god-tier soundtracks like Nier Automata, Elden Ring, and Persona 5. The soundtrack has a breadth of emotional capacity used to elicit a very specific feeling in players, and these emotional roller coasters disguised as music can only be described as enchanting, divine, otherworldly, perfect. And the best part is that most tracks have multiple versions and variations, one for daytime and one for nighttime, both used to convey a very different emotion. Each character as well features multiple theme songs that are all fantastic and are the absolute pinnacle of what music should strive to be within the gaming medium. Take Hikari's themes for example. When Hikari's empire of Ku was overthrown by his brother, he was forced to flee for his life, leaving everything behind but the clothes on his back. While on the run, a fire of determination began to spark inside his heart. That's when he resolved to himself that he would gather as many formidable allies from around the globe and take back his country, even if it meant slaying his former allies. The music that plays during this scene perfectly captures the emotions that the players are meant to feel here. It masterfully employs inspirations from historical Japanese music and beautifully mixes them with modern orchestra to create a symphony that elicits feelings of exactly what the name of the song implies: determination. And when it switches to the boss battle version, they dial the epicness of the song up to 11. There are dozens more examples of how well executed the music is with the gameplay, and how the soundtrack manages to incorporate a multitude of instruments, but if I went through all of them, we would be here all day. And I've listened to hundreds of video game soundtracks in my life, but despite that, I can probably count on my hands how many of them actually stuck with me after I put down the game. After playing Octopath Traveler 2, I can definitively say that this OST deserves to be on the legendary tier of video game music, and Yasunori Nishiki should be respected on the same level as other great composers like Soken, Nobuo Uematsu, and Keiichi Okabe, because he's definitely made a name for himself here. There's so much more of Octopath Traveler 2 that I haven't even begun to discuss, like the sheer amount of side content this game has, or the new water traversal options. But I fear this review has gone on long enough, and you the viewers are starting to get bored at this point if you weren't already. So I'll get to the point. I truly believe that Octopath Traveler 2 is the definitive culmination of nearly 30 years worth of experimentation and progress within the JRPG genre. Much like how Persona 5 was when it came out and absolutely shook the world, generating a massive cult fanbase and solidifying its status as one of the most defining modern JRPGs of all time. Octopath 2 does something similar to that effect and constantly pushes the envelope on what it means to be a 2D game in a 3D era. An era where amazing 2D RPGs like Chained Echoes fall to the wayside simply because not enough people are interested in them. This game is a masterpiece and one of the few shining gems in a sea of mediocrity. And usually more often than not, games that release in a mediocre or bad state, like the recent failure Forspoken, can most likely be attributed to the lack of good leadership. Although he's still relatively unknown to the wider gaming audience, the director of the game, Keisuke Miyauchi, should be proud of himself for steering the development of Octopath Traveler 2 in the right direction and listening to player feedback on the first game, because the result is that we get a game that's worth more than the sum of its parts. Individually, each aspect of the game is good in its own right, but when put together creates a masterful work of art. And even though many people within the gaming community will never touch this game in their life, Octopath Traveler 2 to me will be placed on a pedestal next to the greatest JRPGs of all time and will forever be remembered as the game that defined the genre in an era that forgot about them.